our guest today, professor at Columbia University. He came from UT Austin. He's actually originally from... You got UT Austin back there? Yeah! All right. So, our guest taught there. And he's written a couple amazing books. He wrote one called The Sports Revolution about how Texas changed sports in America. He wrote another one called Forging Diaspora. He's an expert on New York. He's originally from New York, lived in New York a very long time. Please welcome to the stage, everybody, Frank Guridy, everyone. All
Hello.
Right. Yeah, give it up for Frank. Thanks for doing the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Now, just so you know, this is very serious show and very serious interview. I'm going to start it off right off the bat. How are you?
You asked the native New Yorker, one of the four who are here tonight, gathered, how they are. You want a short answer?
Sure.
Fine, I'm good. I'm actually great.
Great.
Yeah.
So you're an expert on sports. You're an expert on New York. You're an expert on social movements. I wanted to talk to you real quick about sports because I think it's something that people write off pretty quickly. A lot of times people will say that they're a distraction. People don't like to watch them. They think it's a waste of time. Why do you think sports are important?
How many sports fans are here? Okay. So who's not a sports fan? Okay, good. No. I
love people cheering for not sports. That's like,
exactly.
Yeah, they suck.
Exactly. Well, because a couple of reasons, for historical reasons.
Okay.
You mentioned the civil rights movement, black freedom struggle earlier.
Yep.
When Jackie Robinson, right, becomes the first black player to break the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947, from that moment on, sports becomes this place where the United States often claims, that it's triumph over racism, right? Because of the prominence of black athletes of color, since the 1970s, the increasing numbers of women athletes, right? So sports becomes seen as this sort of space of democratization, right? Of inclusion, right? We have amazing athletes today, LeBron James, et cetera, and so on. All the football players, folks like Steph Curry, et cetera, and so on. I named two basketball players, those are two that came to mind. So sport is seen as an exemplar of what's good about this country, right? So that's one, right? So it becomes this interesting place where you could see, well, have in fact people of color, black folks and others, advanced because of sports, right? And if you look at a lot of wealthy athletes, you suggest, yes, perhaps so. But then if you look at the business of sport, you look at the amount of money that's generated from sport, you look at the ways in which many athletes actually don't prosper from a career in sport, then you start raising a bunch of other questions, right? Like, okay, why is it that college football generates so much revenue, right, from black athletes or athletes who are unpaid for the most part until very recently, right? Why is it that we invest so much in sports institutions like stadiums, something I've worked on. I have a book I just finished about that, right? So sport then becomes a political question, right? It has deeply political resonance and a social one, and I think those are two reasons why I think sport matters.
Right, and also I thought it was interesting in your book, the book on Texas. You talk about how people succumbed to succumb. You're a professor. Which one is it?
I think it's succumbed.
Succumbed. So people, the actual entrepreneurs and all the business owners and the people who were trying to start the new leagues, all these things, they succumbed to basically market pressures.
Yes.
Because they even though they didn't want to integrate, they kind of had to.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting how sports was kind of basically the battlefield where these kind of things took place in that region before a lot of other places.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Texas, you mentioned Jim Crow. Texas is a Jim Crow state, right? Integration really proceeds much later, right? In the 1960s, 70s, in some places to the 1980s. And some places never integrate, right? So yes, sports becomes this interesting place where we see the collapse of Jim Crow because, yes, you have people of conscience who felt, white people, right, who felt like, you know what, the day of segregation should pass. But then you had a lot of people who realized, if I want my team to win, I need to have the best talent available, and that being black athletes and athletes of underrepresented groups, right? So it opens up the labor market, in fact, for athletes, for team owners and for universities who also generate enormous amounts of revenue from college sports.
And I think this is an interesting point because I think today we're still kind of seeing sports as the battlefield for integration of other types.
You think so?
Yeah, I do, actually. I'm from Florida, so I don't know if you've seen the news. But for example, with
Yeah.
trans in sports,
Yes.
that's kind of now been used as the battlefield where people who have certain views on trans rights and things are kind of using sports as their place to kind of push a certain agenda.
That's exactly right. And so to resist the actual inclusive cultures in sports, right? Because for queer folks, for trans folks, right, sport actually is a space that that many folks in those communities have created for themselves, right? And so once those communities want to push and become more visible, that's when the reaction becomes more strong. And I think that's what's been happening in recent years, unfortunately.
And it's interesting too because you talk about. I've seen a couple of your talks on YouTube. Yeah, that's right. I watch YouTube. No big deal. All right. So I saw a couple, and you talk about how, and I thought this was a really interesting point that the more people play the sport, the better the sport. It's not. I guess we have such a view of sports as something you consume, something you watch, when really the idea is to get more people playing the sport. Because that's where the real interaction, where the real teamwork, where the real integration with another community, with another type of person happens. And I think it's interesting because you see a lot of backlash. For example, I mean, it's really lame. Like you watch, I've watched so much stand-up comedy. One of the hackiest things you could do is make fun of the WNBA. Like it's just something that people do all the time. You're like, all right, whatever. But it's a good thing for basketball. And while it's not the same exact sport as men's basketball, it's doing something for basketball. It's doing something for women's rights. It's doing something for the world and the interaction between two genders, And
in fact, better that it's not like men's basketball, right? I mean, one of the beauties of women's sporting culture is that they have their distinct forms of sport, right? I mean, a WNBA game, have you been to a Liberty game? Anybody here? I think we should have more people at WNBA games. Or if you've been to women's college basketball games, right, the scene is different, right? The game is different, and that's okay. It actually should be that way, right? I mean, I don't think necessarily that we want women's sports to be just like men's sports all the time, if ever.
No, I agree.
That's what I would say.
No, I agree. I think that's kind of the idea behind, I think, women's rights and feminism generally is like you're doing the entire world a disservice by basically canceling out half of the population.
This is true.
It's kind of the same thing, I guess, with sports. Okay, well so moving on. I think what's interesting too, I think, is when you talk about Jackie Robinson and I guess the integration of sports and all that, and that's one way to, I guess, make a point and to change policy. But another one is when athletes start actually becoming autonomous people and start speaking out against certain things, and you see that happening now, obviously. I guess. What's your take on the backlash that people, the shut up and dribble, I guess, mentality that people seem to have, and it's now recent more so than it was, like, let's say in the 90s when people are speaking out more now.
Yes. Yeah. Sport has always been political, right? When the Star Spangled Banner became the national anthem being played at sporting events, right? And when you do it before every single game, that's a political act, right? That is about cultivating loyalty to the nation, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that makes the sporting space political from the beginning, right? As I said earlier, much of what makes the sport business industry happen possible is because of the participation of the state, of the government, right? Whether that's providing public dollars for stadiums, whether that's allowing professional leagues to act as de facto monopolies when they really should, right? Like Major League Baseball, all the professional sports in this country, right? So, and the thing that's interesting about the shut up and dribble argument is that, black athletes have had a long tradition of being active in sports. Right? You mentioned Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson didn't just play for the Dodgers, and then he went off and died at 56 because he was so depressed at the state of racial affairs, in part. He had health issues, of course, too. But he was very active, right? Outspoken, right? Many black athletes, obviously from the 1960s, Muhammad Ali. Everybody know who Muhammad Ali was? Very active, right? Of course, right? Against the Vietnam War, against racism, right? So there's long traditions of black athletes, women athletes. Everybody watching the U.S. Open tennis tournament? I've been there lately. Billie Jean King, right? Perfect example of an athlete activist who we still celebrate to this day, right? So you have these long traditions of athlete activists speaking out for justice in the sports world and outside the sports world, right? That's not new, right? And yet, I think what's happened since 9/11 is that U.S. political culture has become much more repressive, right? And this need to comply totally and not speak out in a public way at a stadium. I really think that a lot of the reaction to the athlete activists, Megan Rapinoe, like, of course, Colin Kaepernick, is really about the kind of repressive political culture we've had since 9/11. That's what I would say.
And you think it's increasing on the part of athletes for a certain reason, or because of the climate we're in, or is there a reason?
Yes, I think...
Because, like you said, there was actor, like in the 90s,
Yes.
Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was a
That's
famous
right.
one, and
That's
he was sitting down for the
Right.
anthem before
That's
anybody
right.
else.
That's right. Tony Thompson-Smith, right? Right here, also in New York, also staged her protest during the national anthem. In the 1990s, the prevailing idea was that we had triumph over racism, right? It's the Clinton era, right? We can just be mindless consumers now, right? We don't have to worry about this sort of stuff. And now what we've seen, as the great Angela Davis and other thinkers have said, that freedom is a constant struggle, right? It's not something we take for granted, right? And so, lo and behold, our freedoms are being threatened now, as far as I'm concerned, and we're in a serious struggle for, what 21st century freedom looks like now in this country, right? So I think athletes obviously have been swept up into that, certainly during 2020 and even before that. Yeah.
It was interesting too, I guess, something we don't really think about, but I was reading, I came across you through Dave Zirin, the author, and he writes a lot about sports. He wrote a great book called The People's History of Sports in the United States, and really amazing, and you guys kind of write a lot on the same themes. But it's interesting, and something we don't think about, that different sports resonate for different reasons. And in your book on Texas, you talk about football resonating in the South the way it does, and it has to do with the regimented, almost like warlike mentality, this like militant kind of lining up and people going to physical battle. There's like an actual physical violence to it. Could you speak on that? I think that's a really interesting point. That
Football's popular all over the country.
Sure, of course,
right?
of course, but it resonates specifically.
But it definitely resonates in the southern context, right? I mean, like, so it originates in the Northeast, right, up here, right, with the Ivy League elites. But then it gets quickly taken up, football, right, by Southern elite men, right, and white men, right, and black men also in a segregated context, of course. And so it really does fit very well within the kind of post-Civil War, the stuff you were mentioning earlier, kind of militarized culture, right, that we see, prevalent in certain southern states. Absolutely, I think that's true. And it becomes really central to sort of white southern masculinity, no question about that, right? So if you watch... I just finished a chapter on the origins and the early history of the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans, right? And how we can see how what they were doing with the Sugar Bowl in those years is kind of reenacting the Civil War, like all the ways in which a football game is being restaged in a North-South conflict, right? So football becomes this text, this space where we can kind of replay, Southern battles, or the Civil War, or the wish for the Confederacy to triumph, right? And that's certainly the case with Southern college football.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in your book too. You talk about how the Cotton Bowl was actually like they would actually have on the side, they would have like white, like the Rangerettes and all these types of dancing troops, but then off to the side you would have
bales of cotton,
and then black bands playing on top of these bales of cotton. And it was really like hearkening back to when cotton was king, when there was actually like slave labor work in the fields.
That's right.
And I guess we kind of forget that's where these things started.
That's right, exactly right. And similar dynamic with the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah.
To some degree, the Orange Bowl in Miami. Like, these are bowl games that were very popular before. Now we have the Cheez-It Bowl and all the kind of corporate sponsor bowls that I don't even know what they're called anymore.
Cheez-It Bowl, by the way, is the sponsor of this show.
My apologies.
Yeah, use TomDNYC code, free box of Cheez-Its. Great. Yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting point. I guess on that note, you see now, I guess, people waking up a little bit, I guess, to certain things. For example, the changing of the names of different teams.
Yes.
That's recently been happening. Like Courtney's actually a huge Commanders fan. Yeah, they changed their name, unfortunately, to the Commanders. But they lost a lot of fans on that one.
Militarism again, right?
Militarism again. Look at that. That's true. That is true.
Yeah.
But I guess, what do you see? How effective do you see those kinds of changes, I guess, in the overall scheme of things, when the ownership doesn't necessarily change, the way that people make money, the different groups represented in different areas of the teams, et cetera?
Yeah, you're asking me to speak about the president. I'm a historian, which means I'm not an authority on this subject. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. I don't want to diminish the importance of that team name change.
Okay.
Right? There's no question, by continuing to call the name, that team, the name that it was called for 60 years, does a lot of harm, right? Perpetuating native, subordination constantly, right? We have other teams that still have not changed their names, right? The baseball franchise in Atlanta, for example. The football franchise in Kansas City. So, yes, those things should change, absolutely. But if they're not accompanied with substantive transformation in which we have a different conception of what professional sports should look like, right? So that if billionaire men are still the ones, white men most of the time running the show, then what are we really changing, right? We're changing we have these cosmetic, symbolic changes without real substantive ones, right? So substantive change means that you have a wide array of people in sports management, which you do not have, right? One of the unfortunate legacies of the 60s and 70s is that you had racial integration of sports, you had the beginnings of the incorporation of women into sports, but you didn't have a change in sports management, right? You had basically white men, right, and the sports management class grow as a result of this transformation, right? So. And that legacy is still with us to this day. Not just, I mean, we have an underrepresentation of women in sports management, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's been a stubborn, that has not changed. And I think that's the core, I think in the sports world, right? Mm-hmm. And unless you have changes on that front, then you're just sort of kind of perpetuating the same kind of exploitative dynamic, right? Where you have super talented athletes make a ton of money, and and get rich and maybe become owners like Michael Jordan, for example. But the vast majority of them do not, right? They're actually dumb. Most NFL players are not making a ton of money. I'm convinced the person who almost died on the field last season, right? Damar Hamlin, mm-hmm. right? I'm sure he's not going to be walking away from football, assuming he plays again, which unfortunately it looks like he will. A rich man, right? So there's this notion that all these athletes are really highly paid, and that's usually not the case, actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, here's a question. I guess there's a decent amount, I guess, of scholarship out there that would say that it's impossible to change that representation without changing the entire system itself.
This is true.
And I guess how would you do that?
I think we have a positive imagination here mm-hmm. around this, right? So I mean, I don't think European soccer clubs have figured it out, but there are different conceptions of sports ownership. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's been an intense struggle. In Oakland, I know we're supposed to talk about New York, but I want to mention Oakland for a second because the Oakland Athletics the baseball franchise have recently announced they're going to move to Las Vegas for another new stadium, of course. Yes, thank you. Boo.
This is an anti-Las Vegas audience.
I agree.
I should have mentioned that up top.
And what's been interesting about the A's fans have been really mobilizing, right? Really, mm-hmm. Calling on the people wearing T-shirts say sell, right? Like really calling on the management to sell. They're not going to sell the team, but now there's these questions about why do we need these kinds of ownership, systems anyway? Why do we think about more collective forms of ownership? Which, it's not practical, but the fact that that's a conversation that's happening as a result of these franchise moves again and again. Major League Baseball recently, many clubs are saying, it's time for a new stadium. We've only had one for 10 years, and now we need a new one, right? So there's been interesting discussion about why do we have this system in place that we do? That doesn't mean it's going to change, but I'm actually pleased to see that that discussion's happening.
Mm-hmm. It would be interesting to see, I guess, things change. I don't know how, I don't know what relation you would say, I guess, with the changes that are happening and I guess this is kind of a bigger question, but with the changes that are happening with, let's say, not changes, but like the fight back, pushback, for example, the different strikes happening right now
yes.
and coming up. Do you think that that's kind of a similar, I guess, we're reaching a kind of similar tipping point with, let's say, I guess the system generally, let's say, of how people are exploited, how people are getting squeezed, and it's happening as well in sports.
Yeah. So you're talking about outside the sports world.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're in a moment of really fascinating labor mobilization. Right. Absolutely. I mean, the writer's strike, for example.
Yeah, right.
At my institution, Columbia University, the graduate students went on strike
right behind
a couple
the worm.
of years ago.
That's me. That's what. I know that's really weird, but it's a bookworm. I'm a bookworm.
Is that what that's supposed to be?
Yeah, I know that's very weird. People are like, "What the hell is that?" Sorry for making a graphic for you guys. All right, unbelievable. Trying to be cutesy.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to catch my breath.
Yeah.
Higher education has been another place where you see a lot of labor mobilization,
yep.
right? So I think that's a good thing. And this is where my now New York background starts to creep into my part of this conversation. Because what working people are fighting for are what working people used to have in this country, mm-hmm. many of them, right? New York City was a union town, right? My folks, came of age in this city as either children of immigrants who, plugged themselves into an already existing union structure, public sector jobs, retirement pensions, right? Like those are things that people had here, once, right? At least for about 50 years or so. Yeah. So it's really interesting to see that there is this pushback that we've seen certainly since 2020, absolutely. And so the sports world is one part of that. Mm-hmm. But obviously, it's extending through various parts of the society. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people used to buy houses. Like the milkman used to be able to buy a house. You know, it's like now, it's like you have to be a millionaire to buy anything here in New York.
Yeah, I've been back here since 2015 when I was in Texas, as we said earlier, and it's really striking to see how much of the old New York has been completely dismantled. You know? Yeah.
Well, before we move on to the next stage of this interview, what gives you hope? What gives you hope, and why do you think what do you think is the best way to continue pushing and trying to change the way things go?
So a lot of times people, when they find out I'm a historian, they'll say, "Oh, right, history repeats itself, right? It's always the same thing over and over again." And I say, No. I don't think that. Actually, history gives me hope, right? Because you outlined the history of Black Americans very quickly, very well. I don't know why you have me up here. You're a real historian.
He's a professor. He said that.
And
just want to remind you guys that. Yeah.
Have a lot of credibility.
Thanks.
And not just because I said it. But behind all those transformations were Black people struggling for justice, right? I mean, none of those, no substantive change happened here, right? Whether it's the era of the Harlem Renaissance, whether it's the civil rights struggle, whether it's the LGBTQ movement, right? Take it, Chicano movement in Los Angeles or in the West Coast, right? Social movement history teaches you that people will continue to struggle for justice. It won't look the same every time. It may make even middle-aged men, scratch their head, like me, scratch their head, say, "Oh, what's going on here?" But nonetheless, what gives me hope is that struggle continues and that people will never just lie down, right? Whether that's in Nazi Germany or in 21st century United States. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say.
No, it's actually interesting. The people who know the most about, let's say, history and who know the most about what's going on in the world, the ones who are fighting the hardest. You think it'd be it's kind of counterintuitive, but that makes sense,
One of my favorite things to do when I look at archives is to see the moment when you see people pushing back.
Yeah.
And that's how like, oh, okay. And that's what I think we've seen that in this country, even though things sometimes look really bleak.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, it's time for a little part of the interview that I like to call rapid fire questions. Here's another graphic for you freaks. Oh, our faces are on fire. Holy Lord, look at that. It's rapid fire questions. Look at that. All right, we got time for a few questions. This is, line it up. I actually made up the concept of questions at the end of an interview. That was my concept. I made that up here. Okay. Here we go. First question. You're from New York originally. What's the craziest thing you've ever seen in New York?
I'm going to go back to when I was in junior high school, a long time ago. It was lunchtime, and for whatever reason, they let the junior high kids go out for lunch and I was going to get my slice of pizza like I typically did in those days. And all of a sudden, I see people rushing through the kind of shopping area where near my school, and they're running, and so and then I hear fight. So I'm like, oh, so like all the other kids, I run to follow the fight, and the next thing I know, I see somebody on the ground stabbed, right? Like literally stabbed by another guy. So it's clear that one guy was chasing another guy, he was stabbed, and he was on the ground, right? Blood coming out of his abdomen, and this woman is standing over this guy on the ground, and I knew her. She's a couple years older than me, hitting him with her shoes. Like just hitting him, and I'm like, to this day, it was almost comic. I'm like, why are you hitting the guy on the ground, who's stabbed? Why are you hitting him with her? And I was like, why? And I knew this person, but I was too afraid to ask her because it just seemed so preposterous. I'm like, what is going on here? This guy needs help.
He wasn't walking fast enough.
This guy, I guess not. My sense is that the two dudes were fighting over her. That was my sense of it, right? So I guess the guy who got stabbed, unfortunately, maybe he was the instigator and maybe he came out on the losing end. But I that is etched.
Wow.
I'm from the Bronx. That to me, it's really the sight of her doing this, and I'm like, and I was just bewildered, right? The whole situation was bewildering. Like somebody gets stabbed during, lunchtime. Like, what's going on here? But then again, that was New York in the '80s. So yeah, that's the one that comes to mind.
Well, that's good. Okay. You're a sick man, Frank.
I'm from New York. What do you expect?
That's cool. No, I get it. All right. Let's keep it going here. What person personifies New York to you?
I'm having a hard time thinking of an individual. So I'm going to think of a person everybody knows here, the delivery workers. right? Immigrant, delivery workers who are congregating outside the Shake Shack, congregating out your local restaurant, the essential workers during the shutdown. That's New York, right? The hustling immigrant worker, right? Putting their lives on the line sometimes, right, to make a living. And so and the image stays with me every time. Every time I'm walking in my neighborhood, I see them congregating, like, on Broadway where I live. I live up in the Upper West Side, and like there they are, ready to take your food somewhere, right? To pick up people's food and deliver it, on their bikes and their e-bikes. So like that. That's what I think of.
Yeah, putting their lives on the line, and the guys who drive the e-bikes putting everyone else's lives on the line.
This is true. This is definitely true. This is definitely true. This is true. Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's keep it moving. All right. What's your favorite piece of New York art? Whether it's a book, a painting, a movie.
Yeah. So I teach a class at the great Columbia University called Black New York. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we do in that class, we take neighborhood walks. Different neighborhoods, Brooklyn. No, we don't make it out to Brooklyn, too far. Bronx, Harlem, obviously. And one of the things that I always highlight is just the murals. Just the arts, like the kind of street art that you see all the time, right? And sometimes it changes really rapidly, right? So the Black Panther mural on 120th and 3rd Avenue. All the kind of proliferation of Black Lives Matter murals that we saw after 2020. Graffiti, obviously, right? I mean, that's another thing, again, as somebody raised in the 80s, that always speaks to me. So I think kind of seeing the creative energies on the street, street performers too. That's another thing I love to see. Like, you don't see many folks dancing on the subway lately. I guess that's by design. But love to see that, right? So that's what I would say. Yeah, I don't think of one particular piece of art. I'm not an art historian, so that's part of the problem. But I love to see artistic expression on the streets, and that's one of the beautiful things about this city.
Yeah, it just kind of has to come out,
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you're on the subway and a mariachi band just has to play.
That's exactly right.
It just comes right out, baby. It's just natural.
That's exactly
What would you say is the one book, if you could say one book that's changed your life?
It's really hard to ask an academic that
We
question.
get it. You read books.
Our job is to read books. Our job, we're so damn smart. No, we're not, actually. We're actually not that smart. We have a PhD, but that doesn't mean we're smart. A great book on a revolution that often gets overlooked. It's C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins. It's his history of the Haitian Revolution, right? The revolution that was led by the enslaved peoples of Saint-Domingue, which is now today Haiti, when they overthrew slavery and French colonialism and beat back the British and created, 13 years later, the independent Republic of Haiti. C.L.R. James was a black Trinidadian activist writer who, in the 1930s, when fascism and the struggles against Hitler were taking shape, he said, and the struggles against European colonialism were taking shape, I'm going to write a book that shows the capacity of black people to create revolutionary change. And when I read that book in college, and he wrote that book in 1938, it still was a classic, right? And it's still a classic today. And it's really an extraordinary story that, he did a great job documenting. So it's like a history classic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Black Jacobins. All
right, the Black Jacobins. All right. Well, we're rounding out here the rapid fire questions. There's just one more question. It's very important. This is tough. Will you be my friend?
I'm not sure. Not sure. That's the skeptical New Yorker in me. It takes us a while to figure people out. Although, you know what? I looked you up on YouTube. I was watching your videos.
Yeah, no big deal. I'm on YouTube.
And you know what? It's actually not a bad thing that you're from Florida. I take that as a potential, bonus.
Perk of friendship.
So on those two bases, I'll say yes. I'll be your friend.
I got a new friend who reads books. I love it. Well, Frank, thank you so much for coming. It was great. It was great to hang out. Great to chat with you.
Thank you.
If you want you to head back to your seat.
Can I take your sour patch?
Take one. Yeah, take one. Go for it. Thank you, guys. Give it up to Professor Frank Guridy, everybody. All right.